Thank you and welcome to everybody who has joined us for this webinar. It's a short 1 hour. I consider it short because time will fly with the amount of information that we're going to share with you today. My name is Ain. I am Regional Head of Client Engagement for Dattel. And my role is basically to work with the team to identify the kind of questions or the kind of data that we want to collect, and to work with the data analytics team to figure out how to actually present the data in a meaningful way that you can actually use for your marketing strategies and marketing purposes. So for today's session, I am very glad that you all can join me because I think this is something that we're very happy and very proud to share with you guys. And this is essentially the 25 behavioral archetypes that we have produced using our consumer intelligence data. So are you ready to kick this off? Yeah, we're ready? Okay, so let's go. The first thing that I guess I would need to walk you guys through essentially is what you're going to discover in this particular webinar. So in the next 60 minutes, hopefully we can settle this next 60 minutes. Of course, I will walk you through the underlying philosophy behind Dattel's behavioral archetypes. I think that's really important for us to kind of set the tone before you understand or before you take a look at what those 25 behavioral archetypes are. And I'm going to show you the behavioral archetypes which exist among consumers in Malaysia and Thailand. So they are the same 25 archetypes that exist in both countries. But we're going to look at the distribution and we're going to try to understand a little bit about what the composition is. And then I'm going to show you some of the examples of how we apply the behavioral archetypes. And I'm going to give you a preview of that using our platform, Voyager, where you can see the behavior archetypes and a lot of other consumer data that's available there for subscribers to use. Okay. So yeah, without further ado, let's continue. So the first thing I think before we go into the philosophy bit, let me introduce also, I've introduced myself. So I think I need to introduce the company itself. For some of you who may have not heard of Dattel before this, maybe for some of you, this is the first time. I think some of you, you've met with our business development teams and our marketing team, maybe even, have known Dattel through our CEO and our founders. So this is a little bit brief for those who are learning about Dattel for the first time. So basically, we were established in 2013 as primarily a data capture company. So our experience and expertise was first in data capture, where we actually built up our own in-house technology. We formed in Malaysia, started operations in Malaysia first, and then we proceeded in the next few years to expand to Thailand and Indonesia. And in 2018, what we did then was to execute a strategic pivot to go into consumer intelligence. So with the technology that we had built up and the experience that we already had with all the data capture, we then proceeded to move into the consumer intelligence field. So basically the idea here is to kind of change the way consumers are able to utilize data or access data about, users, marketeers, business owners, to change the way marketers and business owners can have access to consumer data to make better data-driven marketing decisions. Yeah? So this company was founded by these two individuals, and together they actually have, in terms of market research experience, together collectively, they have 43 years of experience. So you are in good hands, so to speak. Yeah. And then in 2019, of course, our CEO Ashran joined us with his entrepreneurial expertise and his experience in the entrepreneurial scene. So to kind of look at how we can basically take the data and our platform and our business forward. So this is the backbone of the company, but of course, these are the drivers, the main drivers of the company, but of course the backbone also is all the people who come together to make the data available to you, to make the platform available to you, and to make the data mean something that you can use and utilize for your marketing strategies. Okay, now that we've covered very briefly about who the company is and who we are, I think it's important for us to understand a little bit also about Dattel's philosophy. So this is to help understand later on when we go into the behavior archetypes. So the idea here is really, I think when we're looking, especially because of what we've gone through with COVID, we've seen consumer behavior just basically change. And a lot of businesses, I assume, have struggled in the past year and a half, almost pretty much year and a half, almost a year and a half, in trying to figure out how do you move forward, how do you keep your business going, and how do you attract the right kind of consumers, and whether you need to pivot to find the right kind of consumers who you can nurture in the long term. So our philosophy here is that we know that for most businesses, I think the experience has always been to try and understand it from the industry lens. So we try to change that. If I were to use, I don't know if how many of you have heard this parable of the six blind men and an elephant. If you've heard of this, can you reply yes in the chat? If you haven't heard of it, please say no in the chat. Have you heard of it? Okay, so some people have heard, some people have not heard. Okay, then that's fine. So let me just share a little bit. The story is six blind men, okay, men or women, six blind people basically encounter an elephant. And they have never heard of an elephant before, don't know what an elephant is. And this is the first time they're encountering this beast. But not knowing what it is, and they're blind, not being able to see what it is, they are all touching different parts of the animal's body to try and figure out what is in front of them. So one is touching the tusks, one is touching the trunk, one is touching the legs, one is touching the tail, and another is touching the body. So what they end up, maybe I don't know whether some of you have already know how this goes. I think for most of you, those of you who answered yes probably will know how this goes. So basically, what happens is because of the fact that these are blind men touching different parts of the elephant, they all have a different understanding of the being or the thing that is in front of them. The blind person touching the tusks thought it's a spear. The blind person touching the ears thought it's a fan. The blind person touching the body thinks that it's just a sturdy wall. So this parable essentially is how most businesses actually understand the consumer. You're seeing certain parts of the consumer based on the consumer's interaction with your product category or with your brand. So you don't see other aspects that you don't touch or that you don't find any interest in. And that's usually what happens. But the fact of the matter is, whether you're touching the tusk or you're touching the ears or you're touching the legs of the elephant, it is still the same animal. You are actually, in principle, touching the same animal. So what we can say here is this is similar in terms of the consumer. When you're understanding different aspects of the consumer based on the consumer's interaction with your product or with your brand, but you don't see their interaction with anything else, then you're only seeing that one perspective. Not to say that that perspective is wrong, but that perspective limits your understanding of that consumer, or in this case, elephant. But basically, the whole idea here is that the more perspectives you have, the better your understanding will be. So that is the principle behind Dattel's approach. So the traditional approach is when you're looking at it from an industry perspective, and you're seeing it from basically either one industry and maybe trying to connect it with yet another industry, but that's as far as it goes. And largely this is because, well, the cost of trying to get this data is not cheap. And for businesses that are actually able to afford market research services, you probably can attest to the fact that good market research does not come with a small price tag. And therefore, for smaller businesses, most of the time, you can't even get hold of this sort of data. So getting data is really difficult for smaller businesses. But the bigger businesses also don't often look for additional data that would be able to give them that comprehensive view. And as COVID changes the entire landscape of the consumer market, it becomes even more important because now you have to understand what is impacting consumers' interaction with your industry or your product or your service or your brand, and what do you need to look out for. So these are things that we're trying to get to the bottom of, which is why our approach, instead of taking that industry lens, we're taking it from that consumer lens. We're trying to understand the consumer. In a sense, it's like the elephant. We're trying to understand everything about the elephant, where it sleeps, where it eats, what it eats, its behaviors, how often it drinks, how it moves, and how it just interacts with other animals as well. So the same thing with the consumer. We're trying to look at a single consumer and understanding the consumer's interaction with a variety of what we call verticals instead of industry. So whether their interaction with fashion products, their interaction with food and beverage, their interaction with transport and mobility, their interaction with communications, all this put together gives you a single view of the consumer in a way that sometimes in a way that basically most businesses wouldn't be able to achieve. Yeah, so this is the holistic view that we're talking about. So what does this mean for behavior archetypes? Okay, when it comes to conventional behavioral segmentation, usually behavioral segmentation is based on, like I mentioned, how the customer interacts with the business. So whether the interaction is with the business social media or any other touch points, whether, like I said, your social media or your online store or your physical store or wherever you are actually able to interact with the customer directly. So usually the data that you'll be capturing would be about their purchases, when they purchase, when they visit your store, the kind of benefits that they seek or they use, whether they use promos or they use discounts, and also to look at their loyalty and to understand the flow of their journey across all your different touch points. But the thing here is that it is always based on an existing database. If a business has its own database, then you will be using that. If you have your your e-commerce web store, for example, then you'll be looking at the consumer's journey on your web store. Otherwise, then you'll be looking at the interaction of consumers across your social media. But this is usually what we call transaction based because it's just understanding that interaction directly with your brand or with your product. You don't see how they interact with other brands or other products, so you don't know whether you're the first choice or you're actually a backup. So that's one thing. But the other thing also is because it's transaction based, you don't know what happens after they've made the purchase. How do they use the product? How often do they use the product? What do they use it with? What occasions do they use the product or service? So you don't really get to see the rest of the picture of that consumer. And finally, the other thing that's limiting in terms of the conventional behavior segmentation is that you don't really get to see other potential markets because you're only focusing on the ones that have already started interacting with you and you don't know what other potential is out there that you have not yet reached out. So let's say, for example, look at this chart here that looks at individuals as a particular behavior segment. So each color represents one behavior segment. Now, if you take the conventional behavior segmentation, you probably would be able to see maybe one or two more understanding that interaction directly with your brand or with your products. You don't see how they as a particular behavior segment. So each color represents one behavior segment. Now, if you take the conventional behavior segmentation, you probably can you guys hear the audio? Understanding that. Yeah, you can hear the audio feedback, right? Okay, it's gone. Okay, so I was a bit curious about where that was coming from. Okay, anyway, to continue. So essentially what we're seeing here is that with the convention, okay, can you hear me now? If you can hear me, say yes. Okay, great. Okay, so I think there was just like slight technical glitch. Okay, so as I was saying, now what we see here is that when you do behavioral segmentation on a case-to-case basis based on your behavior archetype, based on your behavior or your customer segment or your customer database, you'll be able to see certain behaviors relating to that database, but you won't be able to see other behaviors. So some of these behaviors are pockets of mystery. But with the Dattel approach, so how we take it is firstly, because we're collecting the data from a single source, we're collecting the data from the respondents and we're looking at them in the context of all these different verticals. It's consumption based. So now we're not looking at it as a transaction, but we're looking at it as in terms of how frequently they consume certain products or how much they spend on it and the purpose or the occasion with which they consume the product or the service. The other thing also is that now the data that we collect and the behavioral archetypes is representative of the population. So instead of just looking from the context of just one database that may exclude certain groups, for example, if you're an online fashion store, so you're only seeing people who have actually purchased or visited your online store. You don't see the behavior of people who visit other online stores or other fashion stores or people who just visit physical stores. You don't see that. Whereas in this case, the data allows you to be able to see the entire population and determine then what's the proportion of that probably will interact with your online fashion store. The other thing also is that because we're collecting all the various data across these verticals, we're able to categorize them according to the survey responses across these different verticals, which is why we can come up with 25, and quite frankly, we can come up with more. But I think for now, let's settle on 25, and then we'll eventually start increasing and adding more behavioral archetypes. But essentially, because of the various responses that we've gathered, we're able to categorize them in ways that would be meaningful to understand certain behaviors and certain patterns of consumption. And finally, the other thing also is that while previously for most of the businesses that do the conventional behavioral segmentation tends to look on online digital footprint of the consumers, we're able to capture the offline behavior. So we're able to understand that these behavioral archetypes is not just about what people do online, but what people do in their real lives. So that's the difference. And therefore, instead of just looking at maybe 3 different behaviors, you're able to fill in the gaps that were boxes of mystery previously. Now, I know that for most businesses, I think some businesses, especially the larger ones, already have very clear structure of data with their consumer data or their customer database. And definitely, this is another thing that you can do with this, is to enrich your database with the rest of the behaviors that you may not have seen previously. So that's another thing that you can do. Now, how we get our data? Our respondents are ages 20 to 69 years old. We capture them in Malaysia across all the capital cities. In Thailand, it actually is these 6 provinces, with the Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Chonburi, Khon Kaen, Songkhla, and Srattani. And the identity of the panelists are all verified, so which means we make sure that they are representative of the population, but we also know that they are who they say they are. Sometimes it can be quite challenging with larger panels where you're just looking at volume and there's no way for you to actually verify the identity in terms of their age, in terms of their gender or income, and so on and so forth. But in this case, we take very particular care to curate the panelists to ensure that they represent the different demographic groups that we are looking at. And then the data that we're collecting is quarterly when it comes to surveys. So we're collecting that comprehensive, complex, holistic view, bottom-up view of the consumer on a quarterly basis. And we also do collect data on their app usage with their consent and their permission. So everything complies with the governing personal data protection laws in each of the countries where we operate. Okay. How are we so far? Are we good? Or are there any questions? Sorry? No questions? All right, so now I'm going to show you basically the ways in which you can apply behavior archetypes. So the first method is essentially, it really is about how you want to improve the positioning of your product, service, and your brand. So by using the behavior archetypes, you'll be able to determine where you can find a better advantage for your product, especially in markets where you've got a lot of competitors and you want to find that differentiation or differentiating positioning that would be able to kind of create that distinction. And especially because a lot of businesses have to go online, it is it's almost like nowadays, and especially like it's like a night market almost, where everybody is clamoring for the same set of customers to come and purchase and come to their store, but you need to be able to create that differentiation so you can rise above the noise. Yeah. The other thing is then once you've done that product positioning, then you can also look at how to do targeted communications, because once you've refined your segmentation with different kinds of positioning, then you're able to figure out how best do you communicate with this particular audience based on the positioning that you've identified? And lastly, and this relates more to businesses that have their databases. So if you have a database, what this can do for you is help to improve your conversion by enriching your database, your customer database with the data from our behavior archetypes. Okay, so I think now it's time for us to actually get to know the behavior archetypes. Are you excited? If you're excited, please type in yes or excited in the chat. I would like to know if you guys are okay. Somebody is very, very excited. Okay, cool. So we do need to speed forward, I suppose, because we have approximately 40 minutes left. But the 25 behavior archetypes, first I'm going to show you the distribution by country. So this is what it looks like in Malaysia for the behavior archetypes distribution, and this is data as of quarter 4 of 2020. Now, because as I mentioned, we collect the data on a quarterly basis, that means the data is also updated on a quarterly basis, and we see changes in the archetype distribution. So in about a couple of weeks, I think we will be putting up also the latest behavior archetypes as of quarter 1, 2021. And you'll be able to see how the different behavior archetypes actually change. So this is the spread of the 25 behavior archetypes. The biggest is Chef Me in Malaysia, and that relates to basically people who spend a lot of time in the kitchen, cooking for the household, and also likes to experiment and really not just spending time, but also spending on kitchen appliances. So this is that's the most dominant or common behavior archetype in Malaysia. And as you can see, it goes, we do have the 6 here, which actually happen to be the same in Thailand as well, although in different order. But these top 6 are actually the same set of behavior archetypes that we see in Malaysia as well as in Thailand, and the rest of them kind of is a little bit of a different mix altogether. So it starts the whole, just to quickly go through each of them. So you have Chef Me, as I mentioned. There's Social Media Junkie. I don't think I need to explain that one. There's Accessorize Me, basically people who spend a lot of, who spend quite a bit and spend regularly on purchases of accessories like bags, wallets, jewelry, that sort of thing, shoes. And then you've got House Proud Me, people who are quite domesticated in a way. They like to stay at home, they like to beautify their home, and they really care about their home appearance. Beautiful Me also, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's people who are very interested in their aesthetic beauty. Their skincare, for example, may be a bit more advanced or complex compared to the general public. Then you've got Quick Junk Food Me. Also, I think doesn't need much explaining. Basically, people who like to eat unhealthy foods. But I do want to caution that just because people fall into the Quick Junk Food Me does not mean that they also don't fall in the Fitness Me or other behavior archetypes. So an individual will have different combinations of behavior archetypes describing them. Yeah. So this is the distribution in Malaysia. With the smallest ones are Electronic Me and KTV Clubber. But who knows, maybe after COVID restrictions are lifted, you might actually see KTV Clubber suddenly going back up because, as COVID restrictions change, you might see certain behaviors change as well. And certain behavior archetypes may be increasing in size and other behavior archetypes reducing in size. So this is what's interesting, because as we see the changes across over time, we're actually able to try and understand also what's impacting them, especially because they are very nationwide distribution or nationwide policies or programs that govern behavior at this point. So this is basically data in relation to COVID as people are sort of recovering. But what will be interesting to note is because now we're all experiencing kind of a new wave, unfortunately, we might see changes as well in the archetype distribution, especially going into quarter 2 of 2021. Okay, so let's take a look at Thailand now. And this is what Thailand looks like. If you notice, there are some differences in terms of the order. Previously, Chef Me was the highest. Now, Chef Me as a proportion in Thailand is still a little bit higher than in Malaysia, and bearing in mind also that the population in Thailand is bigger than in Malaysia. But Beautiful Me actually is the most common or most dominant behavior archetype. That is the most widespread archetype, which means that 89.8%, its beauty is, or aesthetic beauty, or your looks, maintaining your looks, is important both to males and females. And then as you can see, then there are further changes in terms of what then matters to the consumer as in Thailand as you go further down. But the top 6 remain the same, just in a different order. Do we have any questions so far? I'm curious to know. Okay, so there is a question here from Jeff. How is this behavior distribution compiled? It's not based on highest spending distribution. It is really based on the responses. The type of behavior is not on spending alone. It is on frequency of consumption. It is on how they consume and the purpose of consumption as well. So we look at it from a variety of different aspects, and then we compile the different responses, and that's how we categorize them into this different behavior distribution. Yeah. So essentially, let's say, for example, you can identify yourself in perhaps several of these behavior archetypes. If I were to say which one I'm going to look in, well, it doesn't matter. I can look at myself and say, okay, I'm a stream me person. I am a fitness me person. I am a nutritious me person. I'm a beautiful me person, not really an accessorized me person. So you can see that consumers have different combinations of behavior archetypes that distinguish them from one to another. And we plan to do something very interesting with that in the future as well. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so this is the behavior archetype distribution so far. Now, what I want to show you also is the top 6 behavioral archetypes. There will be further details about all the 25 behavioral archetypes, but I just want to highlight those top 6. If you remember, we're looking at Beautiful Me, Chef Me, Accessorize Me, Social Media Junkie, House Proud Me, and Quick Junk Food Me, which are the top 6 in both Malaysia and Thailand. So what are these top 6? In no particular order. Accessorize Me, for example, you can see the proportion. Now what we're showing here is not just a comparison of the proportion overall, but what that distribution is by age group. Obviously, if you go into our platform Voyager, which I will show you later on, you'll be able to see the distribution of a lot of other information besides age group, other demographic information, for example, but also other information about their consumption and even their media habits and shopping habits. But for now, what you can see here already is the difference in the composition, where in Thailand, for example, you're seeing that the 20-year-olds or the 20-somethings in Thailand are not so much about accessories, and it's really more dominant among the 30-year-olds. Whereas in Malaysia, you're seeing the 20-year-olds who are the ones who are more actively engaged in purchasing and consuming and buying accessory products, followed by the 30 to 39-year-olds. So you see those different patterns. Next one is Beautiful Me. So Beautiful Me is basically somebody who has relatively a complex personal care routine. And because they use a lot of different tools to improve, it's really about their aesthetic appearance. Not about fitness, but it's just more about skincare and so on and so forth. And physical facial beauty, I would say, more than anything else. So again, we saw earlier that Beautiful Me was much higher in Thailand compared to Malaysia. But yeah, the distribution also is really interesting because you see that the distribution is pretty high for Thailand, but it just goes it steadily goes higher by age group. Although I would like to caution that 50 to 69 here is obviously, in terms of the age range, is much bigger compared to the other 3 age ranges here. So this is 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, and this is 20 years, for example. And then it's the opposite in Malaysia, where it's the young ones who are more interested in beautifying themselves and taking more effort in personal care and facial care compared to the older consumers. Okay, so I've got questions here. I think I will try to address these questions at the end of the session. We do welcome more questions, of course. So Eileen and Farid, although Farid, I think I need you to perhaps explain a little bit what you mean by AOL here. Then maybe we'll try to address your questions at the end of this session. Yeah. Okay, so the next one is chef meat. So as you can see, in terms of the proportion, it's more or less the same in Thailand and in Malaysia. But again, you kind of see the difference in terms of the distribution by age group. So these are people who are the ones mainly responsible for cooking at home. They like to experiment with different cooking styles, and also they tend to purchase more kitchen appliances to really hone those skills. And the next one is house proud me. So they're very particular about how they maintain their house, and they even use home care services on a regular basis. And we see Thailand is a little bit higher in terms of the proportion. But again, in terms of the distribution by age, also we're seeing essentially the distribution is much higher among the younger ones, and then it kind of goes a bit lower in Malaysia for the older age groups. But nonetheless, it's still it's still in the 20% at least. And then quick junk food me, which is I think the fifth. This one I think it speaks for itself. It's just basically people who consume fast food on a regular basis and instant foods, and almost on a daily basis. And what's interesting here is actually we see the proportion is much bigger in Thailand. In Malaysia, we've got about 58% who are quick junk food me individuals. And again, we're seeing the similar pattern of behavior as well. It tends to be higher for Thailand, it tends to be higher among the older age groups. And then in Malaysia, it tends to be higher among the younger age groups. So there's some interesting patterns to be seen already. And the last one that I'm going to show in detail anyway for this session, social media junkie. So what's interesting here, you can see the proportion. Malaysia tends to be more, Malaysians are bigger social media junkies than the Thais. But nonetheless, you can see now suddenly the pattern actually changes, and you see that it's actually the older ones who tend to spend more time on social media, especially even the 40, I would say the biggest group actually is the 40 to 49 in Malaysia. But the same pattern also is seen in Thailand. Okay, so if you want to see more of this, obviously, I will show you a little bit more when we get onto our Voyager platform in a little bit. But essentially, this is all the different behavioral archetypes in summary in alphabetical order. It starts from accessorize me with all the descriptions. So I'm going to kind of breeze through these because we're going to the next part. I think is also very important, which is to understand how do you apply all these behavior archetypes. So all this covers a lot of different behavior activities, from leisure and recreation to media consumption to F&B consumption to fashion and electronics and so on and so forth. So it is pretty comprehensive in terms of how you are looking at the consumer. And it's really up to you as a business to understand which kind of positioning should you be exploring to understand where you can find a better advantage and market your products a little bit more efficiently and effectively. Okay, so in terms of applying the behavior archetypes, as I mentioned, we're going to show you essentially the first two, which is how you can use it for product positioning, and as well as how you use it for targeted communications. For improving conversion, of course, this can be demonstrated if with data that also is using, let's say, if you have your own customer database, and we're looking at how to enrich your customer database with our behavior archetypes and our other consumer data. So probably there are some of you who are interested in knowing more about this. We will later on share with you a link for you to drop your contact information for us to get in touch with you for a one-on-one session if you're interested to know more about this. But for now, for this session, we're really going to touch on these first two things. Okay. All right. So, the first, I'm going to show you basically a couple of case studies, and one is from Malaysia and the other one is from Thailand, and hopefully that will give you a better idea in terms of how we apply this. So the first case study here is in Malaysia. We were sharing some information with an outdoor and a brand that basically sells outdoor products for people who have an active outdoor lifestyle, and also some carrier products like bags, whether laptop bags or and strollers and things like that. So they basically provide a variety of different logistics and individual carrier bags, as well as products and that are for, you may see like mounted, what do you call them? Carriers on four-wheel drives and on large cars, for example. So we talk to them basically to try and understand who they want to position themselves with. So what we looked at here was the data that we showed here for them was looking at people who are in the household income of 5,000 ringgit monthly and above. So based on the 20 to 69 consumer market, that's approximately about 15 or 16 million Malaysian consumers ages 20 to 69. And we can see that 20% of them are living in households that earn 5,000 ringgit above per month. And from that distribution, we look at the behavior archetypes of the individuals within these income brackets. And we focused on a few that is relevant to this particular brand or this particular product. And we looked at Sporty Me, we looked at Mall Me, Fitness Me, Online Gamer, Outdoor Me, Electronic Me. And from there, we're able to draw out that information to see which are the biggest or most dominant behavior archetypes that may be relevant to this particular company. And what we saw was very distinct behaviors across these different income groups. For the 5,000 to 7,000 monthly income groups, for example, the two biggest are actually Sporty Me and Fitness Me. So we know that this particular income group are actually very interested in physical fitness, being very physically active. So that seems to be a particular niche that works well and it's clearly identified. Whereas then we see the higher income, the 7,000 and above, are more interested maybe in more leisure type activities that are a little bit more passive. So this was a very interesting find, we thought, that we shared with the client, because this showed the differences in terms of the behavior archetypes and which one tends to be more dominant in one group over the other. And it was very interesting that we discovered that. The other thing also, we flipped this. Now, instead of looking at it from the income group first, we looked at it from the behavior archetype and then looked at the distribution of income group. This is simply just another way of looking at behavior archetype to understand that what is the proportion of maybe the potential market within each of those behavior archetypes. So if any client or any business that is in the similar line that wants to instead expand to lower priced mass product, then maybe they would want to consider the online gamer group as well as perhaps the Sporty Me group, where there is more potential to grow downwards or downstream into the lower priced mass product range. So these are some of the ways that you could possibly look at to understand the market sizing and the potential market for expansion or for focus. So just a couple of examples based on this one case study. Okay, I have another case study that I want to share with you, which is essentially, and I'm using this on using Thailand data. So a business that is marketing energy functional drink and is looking at how best to position this particular product. And so what we want to do here, I think, is essentially first identify the different kinds of behavior archetypes that may be suitable for them for their positioning. Could it be Fitness Me? Could it be Sporty Me? Nutritious Me? Online Gamer, perhaps? Or Beautiful Me? So what we did was we just looked at all the potential behavior archetypes that we might want to explore so that we can dive deeper into those. There's no point in going into other behavior archetypes that perhaps doesn't fit with the product itself. So it's really up to the user to determine how many different behavior archetypes do you want to see and assess to determine the positioning that fits best. So obviously, by looking at these 5, you could possibly decide based on the preferred market size, based on the consumer composition, and also based on maybe and you as the business owner would probably know best, the competitive landscape within that particular product category. So the first step is that, and then the next step, and this is what's interesting, because we have all this data, and I'm going to show you in a bit, because we have all this data, we're actually able to build a consumer persona or multiple consumer personas for that matter, using these different behavioral archetypes for segmentation. What do you do with these data-driven consumer personas? Well, what we're working on, for example, is to develop an API that would allow you to actually transfer all this into your FB ads so that you can do your targeting better. So now you're going to be using data-driven results, a data-driven persona to set as the criteria for your FB targeting, for example. So that's one of the reasons or one of the uses that you can utilize the consumer persona using the behavior archetypes. And then finally, I'm going to show you also about how you can, once you've done that, then you're going to determine what kind of messaging is actually going to work for each of the different personas or segments that you've identified according to the positioning that you've selected. Okay? So what we're going to show is basically in our platform, our proprietary platform called Voyager. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Voyager. I'm just curious if any of you are already using Voyager at this point. Anybody has heard of Dattel's platform Voyager? If you have, using it or have heard of it, say yes. If you haven't, that's fine. You can say no. I'd like to know in the chat. Oh, okay. No, not yet. So this is the first time. Okay. Some have heard. Okay, the one or two have heard and maybe have had some experience with it, but I think for most of you, this is going to be your first time. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to show you is a platform, and we're going to walk through the persona dashboard that has 3 different dashboards essentially, but the ones that are going to be relevant to the behavior archetype is behavior and identity and product and identity. Okay. Before we go into Voyager, I'm just curious, how are you guys feeling? What are your thoughts so far on what you have seen? Can you share in the chat? What are your thoughts so far? What do you think about the different behavioral archetypes that you have seen so far? Can you type in the chat? Is it interesting? Is it unexpected? Is it something that matches your expectations? Interesting, but have a lot of questions, which is great. The more questions, the better. I mean, we're always looking to continue to, improve and refine the product, obviously. So questions will always help to help us see also in terms of areas that we can make the data more meaningful. Okay, so this is our platform Voyager, and I'm going to log in, and I'm going to use, for this purpose, I'm going to use Thailand data. But I think it's perfectly okay to basically look at it from any, I mean, obviously, if you're a Malaysian user and you're interested in the Malaysian market, you'll be looking at the Malaysian data. So as you can see, this is the landing page, and you have the CI persona dashboards here. You can go with behavior and identity or product and behavior. In this case, because I know that this is a functional drink product and I want to compare it with several behavior archetypes, I'm going to choose product and behavior. So what I see here is a dashboard that allows me to select certain criteria. Let's wait for it to load for a bit. So this is a dashboard that allows me to select certain criteria and then see what the percentage and distribution is like. So as you can see, we have several tabs here: demographics, lifestyle, media consumption, shopping behavior, brand affiliation, some COVID-19 trends, and also messaging. So I'm going to go through demographics and messaging for this purpose. So we're not going to be able to cover everything. Obviously, you know, we're down to the last 10 minutes now of the session. So we're going to have to zoom in really, really quickly. So as I mentioned, we're talking about a functional drink. So I'm going to choose under FMB beverages, and I'm going to choose non-alcoholic beverage. And then under that, I'm going to scroll down and go for energy, isotonic, and functional drink. Now, once I've made that selection, I can see now, can you see my screen? And can you see that it shows the market percentage now is 77%. 77% of the main consumer market size of 36 million consumers overall in Thailand, ages 20 to 69. So the main market size here refers to the Thailand consumer population overall, regardless of whether or not they consume energy, isotonic, and functional drinks. But those who do consume energy, isotonic, and functional drinks is 77% of the main market size. Yeah, you guys with me? You guys are with me so far? Yes? Okay, cool. So now that I've selected this, you can see that the proportion distribution also, it seems that it's a balanced mix of male and female. And you can see the distribution by age, even by monthly household income, by occupation, even by number of children that they have, and even household size and household archetypes. I wish I could go through every single detail with you guys, but unfortunately, there's plenty. But I would be happy to have individual or separate sessions if any of you is interested, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Now, we're going to try with a few behavior archetypes, and I'm going to select first Fitness Me, which falls under the beauty and vanity theme. So if I go for Fitness Me, we're going to see the market percentage change. So now out of that 77% earlier, it has fallen to about 30 something percent, right? To about 40%, more or less, 23.4. Now, that is the size of the market that consumes energy, isotonic, and functional drink, but also happen to be very into fitness. And as you can see, the distribution by age has changed, and the distribution by market center and gender has changed, even distribution by household income. Now, if we are to try with something else, for example, let's go with Beautiful Me, since that's also one of the behavior archetypes selected earlier. Let's see what you can see the changes in the monthly household income. So as you can see, there's always these slight variations to the proportion, and it's really for you as the business owner, as a marketer, to decide then which is the positioning that you need to that works best. And here's the other thing, the Beautiful Me. Remember, in Thailand, Beautiful Me is actually the biggest behavior archetype. Therefore, it is almost, it's pretty much 90% of the entire consumer market for energy, isotonic, and functional drinks. Okay, if we are to try now with a different theme. So let's say I want to go for online gamers, because I thought that was interesting. I'm sure online gamers, people who spend their time with esports, for example, would want to spend as much time and focus on playing their games. So maybe an energy drink for online gamers. So you're seeing here 25%. So that's approximately 33% of the entire energy, isotonic, and functional drink market. So as we go further down, we're also seeing changes in the rest of the demographic composition. So that's already plenty that you can work with to determine then what is actually the market landscape for consumers who are interested in this particular product, who have this particular behavior archetype. Okay, what do you guys think? Interesting? Mind-blowing? Say in the chat if you find this interesting. I would love to know. So feel free to, or maybe, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. I can see there's still a lot of questions. Okay, so the other thing that I need to show, and I kind of need to go through this really quickly, and this one is really interesting, is the messaging part. Now, I want to spend a bit more time on explaining what the messaging really is, but essentially, the short version is that this represents, with behavior archetypes, what I have shown you is what consumers do and their behavior patterns, their consumption patterns. But values here represent how they see themselves or how they want to be seen. So this indicates the desire or the self-image, essentially. So for messaging, that is important for you to determine. If you're looking for this particular group, how do you convey the message so that you are effectively reaching out to this market segment? So earlier on, this is for the online gamers, if you notice. So as I go into the messaging tab, I can refine this a little bit more. So maybe if I want to go for age group, I'm really looking for the 20 to 29 maybe, and 30 to 39. So I'm going to exclude the older age groups. And what I see then, so it starts off with explorer, pleasure seeker, and elitist. So it's still pretty much the same here. In this case, we're still seeing the explorer, pleasure seeker, and elitist as the top three values. And this helps to tell you, with these values, what is the appropriate message, or at least it doesn't have to be literal, but it's definitely, this is the kind of message that will work on that consumer or that consumer can relate to. So can you use these values and the messaging that kind of works with these values in a way to as the main message for your product for this particular behavior archetype? Now, let's say, for example, if we're not going for digital natives and I want to change, and let's see if we go back to Fitness Me. So if I were to change this to a Fitness Me behavior archetype, will we see a difference? Now, suddenly you're seeing a lot of the data is actually significantly higher. But what we're also seeing here is that the values, more or less, these are still remain, explorer, pleasure seeker, and elitist still remain as the three most dominant values. If I were, however, to change this to maybe, let's say, based on household income, let's go for our higher income groups, will we see changes? Now, suddenly, instead of elitist, we're seeing global citizen popping up as a dominant value. The explorer actually is particularly high. So as you make these adjustments and as you try to understand your market a little bit better by incorporating the behavior archetypes, you're actually able to see different perspectives. And using this the data to actually be a bit more precise in terms of how you want to communicate, in terms of where you want to communicate, and in terms of all the different criteria that you need to use to target them better. So there's a lot of different components that you can put together, but starting with a behavioral archetype and then incorporating that to build your consumer persona and then to design the right kind of messaging using data based on their perceived self-image or values of themselves, so that the connection between your product and the particular consumer that you're targeting is more effective. Okay? All right. So I think it's time. I know that there are a lot of questions now, so I do want to look at addressing some of those questions. Can we get started on, hang on a second. Oops. Where were we? We were here. Okay, so we've covered the persona dashboard. I've shown you two examples of what you can do. I'm assuming now that there are lots of questions and I will try to address them because we are running out of time. So let's see if I can go to address some of the earlier questions first. Let me see. Eileen, I won't be able to answer all the questions, I'm afraid, so I'll try to tackle as many as possible. Eileen asked a few questions. Is there any algorithm or statistical model to classify people into the segments? Yes. We look at specific types of questions but we do look at certain types of responses. So it's rule-based at this point to determine whether or not people fall into a certain category. But as we go along, we will continue to refine our modeling so that we're able to look at degrees of consumption within a particular behavior archetype as well. And when we're talking about consumption, the way we attain the data, as I mentioned, it's survey based. So we send out surveys across all the different verticals to our panel, and they all respond to the set of survey questions. And that then is processed, and that's how we utilize the data to put together these behavior archetypes. So as I had shown, Aisun Sucharitkul, I hope I pronounced that wrong. If I pronounced that badly, I am so sorry. As I showed you on Voyager, yes, the breakdown by gender is there available as well. And Eileen also asked about the age group. Yes, it does follow the population skew in that sense. So if we see that predominantly some of the behaviors can be 20 to 29, and as mentioned, because these are also the ones that I showed are also the what do you call the biggest behavior archetypes. So if they are the biggest behavior archetypes, they tend to be more representative of the population because they're almost everybody, or a high proportion of consumers are actually falling within the archetype. But as you go along the smaller archetypes, then you might see the distribution actually change a little bit and not be as reflective as the general population skew. Sorry, let me finish this one first. Highest distribution of social media junkie is within the 50 to 59. I know that you think it might be counterintuitive, but I think the other part also is that it's more for based on the certain types of questions, social media consumption, whether they're using it for social purposes or for the work purposes, or for shopping purposes. So there are certain criteria that we select to fall within basically using social media for social media's sake. But yes, I know it seems counterintuitive that we usually tend to think that it's the young ones who are focused on mobile, on social media, but that's from how the data pans out, that's not really the case after all. Okay. So Farid asked whether this is similar to activities, opinions, and lifestyles. I think usually for the, though if I'm not mistaken, that you're referring that to more of psychographics. Psychographics, I believe, tend to be a bit more on the statement based, whereas this one is really on behavior based. So we ask them incidences of behavior as well as the actual behavior itself, frequency, who they do it with, factors for them, reasons for doing it, and reasons for not doing it. So there are a lot of different things that we cover. But if you want to know more, you can actually explore Voyager and take a look at all the questions that are available to understand a little bit more in terms of how we collect the data and what data is available on our platform. Crystal asked if I can elaborate more on how the data are collected. So as I mentioned, we do see the data is actually from our curated panel. And this curated panel is representative of the population ages 20 to 69. And what we do is we send them surveys on a quarterly basis, but at the same time also another data source that we have from them as well, from the same panelists, is looking at their app usage behavior. So app usage is something that is still in the works before we're ready to present it and to make it available. So we're still fine-tuning some things on the back end, but we're hoping to make that available sometime soon. Okay. Eileen also asked, is it possible to see duplication across archetypes? I'm trying to understand this question, but I would assume it's basically whether there are certain archetypes that are very similar to each other. Well, because we're looking at different types of questions and different types of responses, there may be certain questions that are similar in a way, but not the same. So for example, we have fitness me and sporty me. They seem very similar, but actually fitness me are not necessarily sports type people. They don't play sports, but they're into physical fitness. Whereas sporty me may be more into sports, and to a certain extent, yes, they fall into a certain fitness category, but they're not really exercising people, but they're more active in terms of playing either group sports or individual sports. So there are some slight differences in terms of distinguishing the certain behaviors. But most of them are essentially quite distinct from each other. Let me see if I can answer a few more questions. I know we're already running out of time. Eileen also asked, how are the behavioral archetypes transferable onto the dashboard for ad buying? And how does it match with Facebook data? I think, Eileen, we would probably need to have a separate conversation on that one, but actually we're going to be, I think, introducing this sometime either end of this month or early May. So we should be able to share with you exactly how that's going to be done, but it's using an API essentially, and then matching certain criteria to the list of criteria that's available on Facebook. So in principle, that's how it works. But in terms of showing how it actually works, well, once the API is up and running, then we can show you lah, basically. Okay, let me see what else. Do I have something that can tell us a person's propensity to buy? Well, I think, Jason, for this question, I think because it's kind of broad, maybe what I really suggest is for you to kind of explore the data yourself, and maybe, if you have specific questions about a propensity to buy a certain product, then maybe we can have a little bit more of a detailed conversation on that one. Let's see. Can new archetypes emerge over time beyond the 25? Certainly, yes. So there are still some other aspects that we haven't looked at, and so basically there can be multiple behavior archetypes. As a matter of fact, technically speaking, in principle, you can create your own behavioral archetype by selecting certain types of responses and criteria that you think is important for your product. For example, for some businesses, maybe you're interested in understanding people who are, um, their factors for purchasing a particular is really about proximity or about convenience and things like that. So you could possibly look at certain types of information that you want to put together and create a certain behavior archetype. Okay. Ian asked, will this presentation be sent to us? Yes, it will. Eileen then asked, how often is data updated? As mentioned, we do update the data on a quarterly basis. So what I've shown you just now is data from Q4 2020. In a couple of weeks, I think, or by the end of this month, we will be updating the data to I think in a couple of weeks, we'll be updating it to Q1 2021, because we've just completed the Q1 2021 data processing. So it just takes a while for us to process the data, clean it up, and put it in the right structure for us to basically put it up. Noor Izati asking, is there a more real-time automated data collection process? I'm afraid not. There is no way to ask questions about some of the questions that the data that we're asking is just not possible to ask on a person on a regular basis. If you're talking about behavior and transaction, of course, for a lot of businesses, especially the ones that are doing, whether you're in tech, for example, or your logistics like Grab, for example, then you are able to collect real-time data. But that's real-time data in relation to their usage of your app. So eventually, like I mentioned, we do have app habit usage, so we will be updating that. But in terms of updating the data, it's not going to be like a stream of live update data, because I can tell you, if you want us to do that, you're going to have to pay up a lot more for that kind of service. Yeah, even social media data costs a lot for that kind of stream. Let me see. Zain asked, is the data sourced on ground at site and not online? Well, our panel actually responds to questions using an app. So we send the survey on an app. There's no way we would go on ground anymore. That's our approach since 2018 has really been using a panel app, and they are sent questionnaires for them to self-complete. So that's why we're actually able to continue collecting the data even during the COVID period, because there's no concern basically in going to the ground and having face-to-face data collection. Let me see. If there are more questions, okay. I just want to remind my colleague Vinny has already sent a link. If you want more information, or if you want to explore Voyager, if you want to know how you can actually use this data to enrich your own customer database, fill up the form. There's a Google Docs that's been sent out on the link, in the chat. So click on the link and fill in your details and we'll get in touch with you. There's a question, is it possible that each archetype will also duplicate to each other? Yes. So the archetypes that I've shown you are not mutually exclusive, which means as one person can be a beautiful me, a cashless me, an online gamer, a fitness me at the same time. A consumer can be both a nutritious me and a quick junk food me at the same time. So the behavior archetypes are not meant to be looked at as adding them together makes up 100%. Adding them together makes up like 1,000% possibly, because each consumer has more than one archetype. So I think in terms of the percentage of fitness me is also beautiful me. Okay, Eileen has just kind of clarified her question. At the moment, it's not yet available, but we're working on the back end to see how we can be able to look at in a way for you to look at stacking or looking at multiple behavior archetypes at the same time to see how many people actually fall within that particular category. Okay, so I think I've answered as many questions as I possibly can. I think I pretty much answered all the questions. So as I mentioned, if you're interested to know more, whether you want to try Voyager for yourself or you want to understand a little bit deeper about behavior archetypes, or you want to see how can we use the archetypes to actually enrich your customer database, please fill in the form that Vinny has shared in the chat. Please click on that form and fill in your details. We will get in touch with you. So I just want to know from everybody who is still here, how do you feel about the session? What are your thoughts about what you have seen today? Do you think it's exciting? Do you think it's interesting? Do you think it's valuable for your business? Would you like to know more? Maybe you guys can put it in the chat. Yeah. So please, I'm very glad to have been able to share that, and I kind of sped through the whole thing within 1 hour, and I'm very proud that we're able to kind of stick somewhat to the time that we had agreed on. Yeah, we will share the slides with you, and we will share a recording of the video as well for you to kind of, do your, homework, I suppose, and study a little bit more. And if you want to request for a trial of Voyager, please fill in the form and then we'll get in touch with you and we can do an onboarding and walk you through the whole platform itself. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it. If there are no more questions, I really want to thank everybody for coming on this session. Very glad to have been able to share all the behavior archetypes with you and to show you what you can do with it and the kind of data that we have. I hope this has been a very meaningful and insightful session for you guys. If you want to know how you can use this for your business, reach out to us. Look forward to talking more to all of you. And hope to see you using Voyager anytime soon. And thanks very much and have a lovely day ahead.